Welcome to the St. John Paul II National Shrine, and welcome to our exhibit on St. John Paul II and the Shroud of Turin. My name is Grattan Brown. I'm the Director of Mission and Ministry here at the Shrine. And we'll start our tour with this sculpture. You might be asking, well, why do we start a tour about a pope and a shroud with a sculpture? And this sculpture represents in three dimensions what Dr. Gilbert Lavoie, a shroud researcher, observes in the two-dimensional image on the Shroud of Turin. Dr. Lavoie has studied the Shroud of Turin, its blood marks, the image on the shroud, for over 40 years, using his expertise in internal medicine and forensic science. His conclusion is that the image on the shroud is that of an upright man who is lifted up from the ground. He then worked with an internationally renowned artist, Pablo Eduardo, and together their collective understanding of human anatomy, they produced this sculpture, which is perhaps the best three-dimensional representation of what we see in the image of the Shroud of Turin. We profile Dr. Lavoie's work in part 2 of our exhibit, but before we get to that, we'll understand a bit about John Paul II's teaching on the Shroud of Turin in scripture and tradition and history and science. We entitled this exhibit, "Lord, You Could Not Love Me More." This exclamation was John Paul II's response when he visited the shroud in 1998. When he entered the cathedral, he paused before the Eucharist, teaching with his actions that it is Christ, the foundation of our faith, and relics such as the Shroud of Turin are signs of God's grace in the life of a saint, or in this case, in the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. John Paul II also called the shroud one of the most unsettling signs of the Redeemer's suffering love. It's an unsettling sign not only because it bears the marks of the crucifixion, but also because of the uncertainty whether the Shroud of Turin is the shroud spoken of in Scripture. And John Paul II recognized this mystery. He urged the scientific study of the shroud, but he also recognized the power of the shroud to enliven our consciences and enkindle our faith. And so he encouraged popular piety and devotion to the shroud. Let's continue then and look at the shroud in scripture and tradition, history, and in science. The shroud is the burial cloth of Jesus, referred to in scripture, found in the tomb by Peter and John. The Shroud of Turin is traditionally understood to be the shroud referred to in scripture. It's about 14 feet long, 3.5 feet wide, a herringbone weave with a seam joining two parts of it. That seam and the herringbone weave date to the ancient world in the area of Masada, about a day's walk from Jerusalem. On the Shroud of Turin, you also see the faint image of a man, blood marks. Those two parallel lines are scorch marks from a fire in the 16th century. We might ask, what happened to the shroud after Peter and John found it in the empty tomb of Jesus? And the answer is we're not certain. There are no public records of the shroud for the first 14 centuries until a public display in Lire, France. Then for 2 centuries it's in France until it ends up in Turin, where it exists today. We don't know where it traveled in the ancient world. Antioch is a good bet because Peter led the church in Antioch when he left Jerusalem. Other places it could have gone afterwards, or Constantinople, Athens, but we're really not sure. Others have noticed, however, that some ancient icons of Jesus, the face resembles the face and the image of the Shroud of Turin. The idea was that ancient artists contemplated the shroud and represented the face that they contemplated in the icons that they created. Also, you notice this picture. This is the entombment of Christ and the coming of the three Marys to the tomb. And in the lower half of this painting, you'll notice the shroud with that zigzag pattern. Perhaps this represents the herringbone weave of the shroud, with the little circles representing the blood marks. So there's some evidence in ancient Christian art of the existence of the shroud in the ancient world. So how should we think about this mystery of the Shroud of Turin? The quick answer is through faith and reason, the teaching of the church, the example of the saints, and history and science. The church has never taught that the Shroud of Turin is authentic, nor that it is inauthentic. St. John Paul II called the shroud a mirror of the gospel because it reflects the crucifixion and the resurrection. But he also said that the shroud is a challenge to our intelligence because of the many questions that it raises. We should also recognize the possibilities and the limitations of the scientific method. So let's look for a moment at what scientists have investigated and what they found about the Shroud of Turin. In the late 19th century, an Italian Secondo Pia took the first photograph of the Shroud of Turin, and not on a smartphone. Old-fashioned photography created a negative image of whatever it photographed, and the negative image of the Shroud of Turin revealed details of the image and the blood marks that no person had ever seen, at least no modern person. Then three-dimensional imaging technology created a three-dimensional representation of Jesus' face based on the image on the shroud in 2 dimensions. Pollen samples showed that the shroud had traveled through the region around Jerusalem. And finally, blood sampling showed that what appears to be blood on the shroud is in fact blood. And in the modern world, we sometimes think that science is eventually going to disprove traditional truths. But it sometimes happens that scientific investigation proves those traditional truths accurate and adds new insights. And I think that's what we're seeing in the scientific investigations of the shroud today. Scientific investigation has also raised some controversy. In 1988, carbon-14 dating dated the shroud to the 14th century. And popular media immediately ran with the story that it's a medieval forgery. But soon after, scientists reviewed the data and said, well, you need a much broader sampling of material from the shroud in order to accurately do carbon-14 dating. It needs to be repeated. Carbon-14 dating has not yet been repeated, and yet you still find on the internet today some of those popular reports that it's a medieval forgery. However, in the meantime, scientists have developed other dating techniques. For example, you can use other organic material than carbon-14 dating. Also, cloth degrades over time, and scientists have compared the Shroud of Turin, a cloth whose age they don't know, with other ancient cloths whose dates they do know. Understand the rates of degradation over time, come up with a date range for the production of the Shroud of Turin. Finally, there is an X-ray dating technique, and when you put all these different methods together, scientists have determined the date of the Shroud of Turin somewhere between the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD, which includes the time of Christ. Now let's take a look at the full-size replica of the Shroud of Turin at the end of our ambulatory. This full-size replica of the Shroud of Turin is on loan to the St. John Paul II National Shrine by the National Shroud of Turin exhibit. It's 14 feet long, 3.5 feet wide. On the right-hand side, you see the back image of the man. On the left-hand side, the front image of the man. And Saint Joseph of Arimathea would have laid Jesus' body on this side, the right side of the shroud, and folded the other half over his body. On the left-hand side, you see the blood marks on the head, on the hands and the feet, running down the arms, and in the side. On the right-hand side, you see the blood marks from the scourging. The blood on the shroud would have been the last blood that flowed from Jesus' body. And in ancient Jewish theological understanding, the last blood that flowed from a sacrifice was called the blood of atonement. And that is what has atoned for sins. So the blood that we see on the shroud is the blood of atonement that atones for the sins of humanity. In the chapel, you'll find 5 images of the 5 different blood marks on the shroud. And we place them there for pilgrims to be able to contemplate these wounds, to be able to contemplate the blood of atonement that is offered for the salvation of humanity.